What if everything you learned in history class was a lie? This looks like a typical history class. A map of the U.S. hangs on the wall. A portrait of George Washington stares from above the whiteboard. Maybe you remember the flag, the pledge, and the dusty textbooks you barely opened. But what if I told you that much of what you learned in that classroom was a lie, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but a carefully curated version of events designed to shape how you see your country and yourself? Because history isn't written by the winners, it's written by those who want to stay comfortable. And the truth? That's much harder to teach. The cost of believing the myths. We're not talking about little slip-ups here. We're talking about the foundation of an entire nation, built on stories we were taught as gospel. Lies like, America saved the world in World War II, the Thanksgiving was a feast of peace, that the North was the moral compass during slavery, that Rosa Parks was just tired. These aren't harmless mistakes. They shaped laws, justified war, and erased resistance. So buckle up, because once you hear these lies, you can't unhear them. Number 1. America the Liberator. We love to imagine America as the brave nation that stood up to Hitler and saved Europe. It's the stuff of movies, medals, and moral pride. But in the 1930s, long before Pearl Harbor, many Americans didn't want to get involved. In fact, they admired Germany, not just for its recovery from World War I, but for its strong leadership, order, and, disturbingly, its racial ideology. In February 1939, 20,000 people packed Madison Square Garden in New York City under swastikas, cheering speeches that echoed Nazi propaganda. Charles Lindbergh, yes, the heroic aviator, openly opposed going to war. He said America shouldn't risk its blood for foreign problems, and he wasn't alone. The America First Committee boasted 800,000 members, including future presidents like Gerald Ford and John F. Kennedy. So when we say the U.S. rushed to stop the Nazis, the truth is far murkier. Number 2. The Great Chicago Fire and the Cow That Didn't Do It. You've probably heard the tale. Mrs. O'Leary was milking her cow. The cow kicked over a lantern. Boom. Chicago burns. It's a gripping story. Simple, visual, and tragic. But there's just one problem. It's not true. Mrs. Catherine O'Leary was an Irish immigrant, already a target of prejudice. The day of the fire, she said she was in bed. An official inquiry agreed. No one could prove how the fire started. But newspapers ran with the cow story. It was catchy, it was dramatic, and it conveniently blamed a poor immigrant woman. When she died, they said she died of a broken heart. It wasn't until 1997, yes, 1997, that the city officially cleared her name. The truth came too late. Number 3. Rosa Parks, not just tired, the textbook version. A tired seamstress refused to give up her seat and sparked the civil rights movement. But Rosa Parks wasn't just tired, she was an experienced activist. She had trained at civil rights seminars. She worked closely with the NAACP. She had been preparing for that moment. In fact, a teenager named Claudette Colvin had already refused to give up her seat months earlier. But civil rights leaders didn't choose her as the face of the movement. Why? She was too young, too outspoken, and soon, pregnant. Parks was chosen because she was dignified, respected, and ready. So no, it wasn't spontaneous. It was strategy, and that doesn't make her story less powerful, it makes it more. Number 4. Pilgrims in Black and White. Remember those school plays where kids dressed as pilgrims in black clothes, white collars, and big shiny buckles? Turns out that fashion show was totally fictional. Real pilgrims wore colorful clothes. Reds, greens, browns, dyed with natural materials. The black and white image came from 19th century artists who had no clue what pilgrims looked like, so they just dressed them like their grandparents. But that drab image stuck. It matched the Puritan stereotype, and it became part of the costume of American history, literally. Number 5. Women only started working during what tours? You've seen the posters. Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled, ready to work. But women didn't suddenly start working during World War II. They'd always been working, in factories, on farms, in mills. Before industrialization, women and men split household labor. Afterward, women made up a quarter of all industrial workers. What changed was the narrative. After the war, women were pushed out, told to go back home, raise kids, and stay quiet. The idea that women were only housewives? That's a lie designed to erase their labor. Rosie wasn't the beginning, she was the interruption. Number 6. Abner Doubleday. Invented baseball? Baseball. As American as apple pie, and the guy who invented it? Abner Doubleday, a Civil War general. Except, he didn't. That story came from a letter written decades after the fact, by a man who later went to an asylum. A sporting goods tycoon named Albert Spalding pushed the narrative because he wanted baseball to have a proud, all-American origin. In reality, the game evolved from British sports like rounders and cricket, but truth was no match for marketing. Number 7. Let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette, the decadent queen, the symbol of elite cruelty. She looked down at starving peasants and said, "Let them eat cake." Except, she didn't. That phrase existed before she was born. It was likely misattributed by revolutionaries eager to vilify her, and yes, she was privileged. But that exact quote, fiction. It's easier to hate someone when we give them a perfect villain line, but history's not a movie. Number 8. Bastille Day was about freedom. We're told the storming of the Bastille was about freeing innocent prisoners, a French July 4th, but by 1789 the Bastille held just 7 men, most of them for petty crimes or political embarrassment. The mob wasn't there for justice, they came for gunpowder. The violence that followed wasn't heroic. Guards were murdered and decapitated, heads paraded on pikes. But the story was rewritten as a triumph for liberty, because revolutions need myths too. Number 9. Gandhi. The saint with shadows in school, Gandhi was portrayed as a peaceful prophet, the man who brought down the British Empire with nothing but silence and sandals. But the real Gandhi was far more complex. Before he led India's freedom movement, Gandhi spent time in South Africa, and he didn't exactly embrace racial equality. He once wrote, "We believe as much in the purity of races as the white men do." He referred to black South Africans using offensive slurs. He fought to keep Indians from being classified alongside them, and there's more. To test his spiritual discipline, Gandhi slept naked with his teenage grandnieces, claiming he was resisting temptation. His campaign erased same-sex depictions from Indian temple art, calling it sexual impurity. None of this erases his impact, but it forces us to let go of the cartoon version. Gandhi wasn't a saint. He was a man, with flaws, contradictions, and a legacy that deserves both admiration and scrutiny. Number 10. JFK and Civil Rights. A reluctant hero. Textbooks love to credit President John F. Kennedy for civil rights, but JFK wasn't eager to lead that fight. When Martin Luther King Jr. planned the March on Washington, Kennedy tried to stop it. He feared it would embarrass his administration or spark violence. He even sent Vice President Lyndon Johnson overseas during the march, just to keep him out of the spotlight. Kennedy only took strong civil rights action after pressure from activists, and after the assassination of Medgar Evers. Even then, he thought the legislation would fail. When JFK was killed, Johnson took over, and used the nation's grief to push the Civil Rights Act through Congress. But history gave the credit to the fallen president, not the man who made the law reality, because martyrdom is easier to celebrate than messy politics. Number 11. The Good War. With bad behavior, World War II is often seen as the clean war, good guys versus bad guys, a moral battle, but American soldiers weren't always heroes. In Sicily, U.S. troops murdered dozens of surrendered prisoners in what became known as the Biscari Massacre. Across Europe, GIs committed more than 14,000 rapes. In the Pacific, U.S. troops collected gruesome souvenirs, Japanese skulls, ears, teeth, sometimes sent home as gifts. Even President Roosevelt once received a letter opener made from a human bone. No war is clean, but our books often scrub out the blood we spilled. Number 12. Japan didn't stop at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is remembered as the moment the war came to U.S. soil, but it wasn't the only attack. Months later, Japanese submarines shelled coastal oil fields and military bases in California and Oregon. They also launched 6,000 fire balloons, massive bombs meant to ride the jet stream across the Pacific. One killed 6 people in Oregon, including a pregnant woman and 5 children. Japan even invaded the Aleutian Islands in Alaska and held them for over a year. Why haven't we heard of this? Because the U.S. censored the news. If the Japanese knew it was working, they might try harder. Number 13. Only whites own slaves? Slavery is often painted as a simple binary story, White oppressors, black victims, but history is rarely that neat. Some Native American tribes, including the Cherokee, owned black slaves. In fact, by the Civil War, the Cherokee Nation alone held over 4,000 enslaved people. When war broke out, they didn't side with the Union. They chose the Confederacy to protect their slaveholding economy. Even more complex is the story of free black Americans who owned slaves. Some did so to purchase family members and protect them from harsher masters, but not all. William Ellison, one of the richest black men in South Carolina, owned 63 slaves and worked them hard on his 900-acre plantation. Then there's Anthony Johnson, a black landowner in colonial Virginia. He went to court to claim a black indentured servant as a slave for life, and he won. That 1654 ruling became one of the first legal precedents for race-based chattel slavery in America. So slavery wasn't only about race, it was also about status and profit. Number 14. Slaves rarely resisted. Most classrooms only mention a handful of slave rebellions, like Nat Turner's Uprising or the Amistad Revolt. But the truth? There were over 300 known revolts and conspiracies throughout American slavery. In c. 1739, around 100 enslaved people launched the Stono Rebellion, killing slaveholders and marching toward Spanish Florida, where slavery was outlawed. In 1811, the German Coast Uprising erupted near New Orleans. Dozens of enslaved men raided weapons depots and tried to seize the city. They were brutally put down, their heads impaled on pikes along the Mississippi River. Some revolts even succeeded. In 1841, enslaved passengers aboard the Creole overpowered their captors and sailed to the Bahamas, where they were granted freedom. Others fought alongside native allies, seizing forts and holding them against U.S. forces. The myth of passive slaves was invented to comfort slave owners, justify oppression, and erase the truth. But resistance was everywhere, brave, bloody, and unforgettable, if you're willing to look. Number 15. Native Americans didn't understand land? One of the oldest colonial myths is that indigenous people had no concept of land ownership, that they wandered the wilderness without rules, that they didn't own the land, so Europeans weren't really stealing anything. But this was never true. Most tribes had deep, sacred, and structured relationships with land. Territories were divided and passed down. Fields were cultivated. Rights were negotiated through tradition and governance. What confused colonists wasn't that native people didn't understand ownership. It was that their understanding wasn't capitalist. They didn't fence land. They didn't flip it for profit. So colonizers dismissed their rights and declared the land unused. Philosophers like John Locke justified this theft by claiming that only those who worked the land deserved to own it, and in his eyes, that excluded native nations. This myth didn't arise from ignorance. It was a strategy to erase indigenous sovereignty with the stroke of a pen. Number 16. The North was morally against slavery. We're taught that the Civil War was a battle of good versus evil, that the North fought to end slavery while the South clung to it. But the reality is more complicated. Slavery was legal in every colony at some point, and in the 1700s, New York City had the second highest slave population in America, behind only Charleston. Northern merchants, bankers, and shipbuilders grew rich off the backs of enslaved people, their cotton, their sugar, their labor. When the war began, New York City almost seceded from the Union, because Southern trade made the city rich. Even George Washington, the face of American virtue, enslaved over 100 people, and signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law. The North abolished slavery slowly, reluctantly, and unevenly. Yes, it ended slavery, eventually, but not without compromise, resistance, and hypocrisy. Number 17. The Real Thanksgiving. Yes, Thanksgiving. Pilgrims and Wampanoag sitting around a table. Peace, gratitude, unity. But that story is more fantasy than fact. The man we call Squanto was kidnapped by English traders, sold into slavery, and taken to Europe. Years later he returned home, only to find his village wiped out by European disease. When the Pilgrims arrived, he helped them, not out of generosity, but because he had nowhere else to go. There was a harvest feast in 1621, but it wasn't a grand alliance. The Wampanoag weren't formally invited. They showed up armed, thinking the gunfire they heard was an attack. Later, Thanksgivings? Some celebrated massacres of native people, like the 1637 Thanksgiving declared after colonists killed hundreds of Pequot men, women, and children. The holiday we honor today was born from myth, shaped by 19th century nostalgia, cleaned of its blood. But history remembers what textbooks try to forget. Facing the past, or repeating it. So, what now? You've heard the lies, the myths, the convenient stories. You've seen how history was polished, repackaged, and passed off as truth. But now, you know better. And history, real history, doesn't need to be comfortable. It just needs to be honest. Because only when we face the past can we begin to shape a better future. Don't let the truth stay buried. If this video made you think twice about what you were taught, don't stop here. Hit the like button so more people see these hidden truths. Subscribe to uncover more untold stories that schools left out, history that challenges, confronts, and finally makes sense. And share this video with someone who still believes the myths, because the only thing more dangerous than a lie is staying silent about it.